Do svidania, tovarish. Oh, that was a weird noise that came out of my body. Hello everyone, welcome to Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts. I'm your host, Michael Lucht. I'm a little under the weather. You have to bear with me. My brain is frying like a scrambled egg, but I'm going to get this goddamn episode out if it kills me. So today we're going to talk about the precursors that led up to the Soviet Union delving deep into psychotronics research. Now, this was going to start out as a sort of a occult crime atlas. However, not a lot of occult crime happening in Russia, specifically early 20th century Russia. A little bit more after the Soviet Union collapsed, as I'm sure you can understand why. But yeah, the main thing that I got into while looking into all this, really, there's this story that kept coming to mind. Now, the more I look into this particular era of occultism, late 19th, early 20th century, and the coinciding rise of psychiatric medicine, it reminds me of an apocryphal argument had between Carl the Gustav Jung and that coked up motherfucker Freud. One that got so heated that apparently, allegedly, books flew off the shelves, according to one version of the story at least, all by themselves. Poltergeist activity, essentially. Apparently, the topic of the argument was the need for psychiatry and psychology to stand as a shield against the, I forget the exact phrase that Freud used, but like the dark muck of occultism, something like that. Is there any truth to this? Because it seems like psychology was being used to reframe various occult beliefs, quote unquote, or explain them away or determine which ones were safe or unsafe around this time. This is a real tension that haunted the very birth of modern psychiatry and psychology. And yes, there is a grain of truth to that flying book story. That's a little bit, it's a little bit off the cuff, retelling the fish gets bigger. But this story, it actually starts and comes from old Carl Gustav himself in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, 1961. He recounts an episode around 1909, 1910 area. I don't know when my voice did that, so I just wrote it out. In Freud's Vienna study. Jung said that while he and Freud were in a heated debate about the reality of psychic phenomena, quote unquote, specifically whether occult experiences had any objective validity, they both heard a loud crack from the bookshelf. Now, Jung insisted it was an example of, quote, catalytic exteriorization phenomena, basically what we now call a poltergeist-like psychokinetic event. Freud, very likely coked up and uncomfortable with the idea, dismissed it as mere chance. But then another crack sounded immediately afterwards. Jung records that Freud looked, quote-unquote, startled. Easy to do to a cokehead. So yes, Jung remembered it as real, an unsettling moment where the unconscious made itself heard, quote-unquote. Later retellings in Jungian circles turned it into books flew off Freud's shelves, but in Jung's own words, it was a cracking sound and psychic pressure, not literal flying objects. The deeper philosophical rift between the two, Freud... I just love calling him a motherfucker. It's hilarious to me. But anyways, Freud, he saw occult beliefs as dangerous regressions, superstition, dressed up in the language of the unconscious. In letters, he called occultism the black tide of mud. That's what it was, that psychology had to keep at bay. It's a secret mission underlying psychology. His project was to reframe religious/occult experiences as neurosis, symbols of repressed sexuality or unconscious drives. Hence, psychiatry as a dam, I guess, against the black tide of mud that is occultism, is essentially more or less a fair summary of Freud's view. Jung, on the other hand, was more sympathetic to the possibility of the occult having objective reality, such as seances, synchronicities, psychic phenomena, etc. In fact, he wrote a dissertation on a mediumist a mediumistic relative, called On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena in 1902. Jung believed psychiatry should integrate and interpret occult experiences, not just debunk them outright, because they were part of how the psyche expressed itself in certain instances. So essentially, it's quite true that early psychiatry wasn't just a neutral science. It was very much engaged in policing the boundaries between what was considered acceptable and unacceptable forms of belief. In Western Europe, Freud and his followers medicalized the occult as neurosis, trying to protect psychiatry's scientific legitimacy, more or less. In Russia, in Soviet Russia, and the USSR, I'm going to get the terminology fucked a lot of times on this, so bear with me through this episode. In pre-Soviet Russia and the USSR, psychiatrists labeled mystical sects and practices as pathological survivals that were largely socially dangerous. In both cases, psychiatry became a gatekeeper, deciding whether an ecstatic state was quote-unquote mysticism, such as equaling, therefore, unsafe and delusional thought, or psychological symbols that were safe and easily interpreted. In other words, psychiatry was positioned as the rational firewall against what was seen as a rising tide of occultism in the late 19th and early 20th century. Not long after, we would also see the rise of what would be called punitive psychiatry in the post-Bolshevik Revolution Russian nation. This is basically state weaponization of psychiatry. So, as we go through this examination, you will see that there are definite instances where that is very much the case. However, we will also see in our examination of such various occult beliefs as they were viewed through the transition of the Russian quote-unquote Silver Age, roughly late 1890s to late 1920s, and to a lesser extent post-Soviet Russia, which we'll get a little bit into. But there was very much a, shall we say, schizophrenic worldview of esoteric beliefs. In fact, Russia has long been known for an unofficial practice called devothery. You're going to hear me butcher some Russian too, so can't be helped. But basically it translates to double belief, referring to a fairly historically consistent coexistence between the Orthodox Church Christian beliefs of Russian folks and existing alongside incredibly ancient shamanic and folk magical practices or beliefs. So this form of quote-unquote double belief would also express itself in various ways throughout the Soviet regime, however in a far more quiet, subdued, highly paranoid style, if not outright manifesting itself in what essentially amounted to the religious fervor of interpretations of Marxism, showing a sacred reverence for Lenin's corpse and Stalin ultimately occupying a central quote-unquote messianic role, surrounded by iconic propaganda and intentional social engineering of his own cult of personality, etc. We'll get into it a little more, but I think this basically lays the groundwork for much of what we're going to get into this particular episode. Before we do that, real quick, let's hear a word from our sponsors. Привет, товарищ. Liqueur gummies combine DHM, milk thistle, and B vitamins and ginger root to help your body recover after drinking all that vodka. Come on, I'm trying here. Got a theme going this episode. They fight fatigue, nausea, and dehydration, so you wake up feeling refreshed. Try them for faster recovery and enjoy an exclusive discount with my promo code ICON, ICON, for 20% off any product, exclusively for Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast. Just head to liqueur.com, LIQURE.com. Thank you. And during those sad, sad Soviet moments where you're possibly stuck in a gulag and can't get your hands on any vodka, well, guess what? They're Shimmerwood beverages. Shimmerwood's award-winning CBD seltzers combine full-spectrum CBD with natural fruit shrubs, delivering a refreshing, stress-relieving drink that eases tension and promotes relaxation, as well as joy among the proletariat commonwealth. Enjoy an exclusive discount with my promo code ICON, ICON, at shimmerwood.com for 30% off any product exclusively for kooks, cranks, and iconoclasts. Thank you! So, pre-Soviet Russian occultism. Let's get into the scripted, more logically based. The more logically based, well, as I said, scripted material. I want to make a note off the top. The Mad Monk, Rasputin, has been covered to death, or suspected death, followed by suspected death, etc. If anything, I think this episode will provide some rather enriching context as to what the fuck was up with Rasputin, Russia, and the historical events following his alleged death. I'd also like to direct you to another anomalous individual from this era, the one Baron Roman von Ungern Sternberg, aka the Bloody Baron. Bit of a ruthless proto-Nazi, and a man initially believed by many of his followers to be the human incarnation of the Tibetan/Mongolian war god Mahakala, and one crazy motherfucker. While he gets a brief overview in this episode, my brother and I did an episode on him a while back, and it's in the archives if anyone's interested. But, jumping right into things, the Great Game was the 19th and early 20th century geopolitical rivalry between the British Empire and Tsarist Russia, largely centered on control of Central Asia, Afghanistan, Persia, and the approaches to India. Exploitation and containment, quote-unquote, of China were also big factors. British fears of Russian encroachment on India, the jewel in the crown of the empire, so to speak, clashed with Russia's drive southward for warm water ports and regional dominance. The result was a century of espionage, diplomatic maneuvering, proxy wars, exploration, and stab-in-the-back bullshit, much of which was carried out in remote and poorly charted regions. Intelligence officers, surveyors, and disguised agents, men like the ridiculously named Sir Francis Younghusband, Nikolai Przhevalsky, nailed it, and Arthur Connolly, who coined the term or phrase Great Game, which also proves that this was a game to them. They had next to little or no concern for the lives of actual people roped up in all these shenanigans. They all risked their lives in hostile territory. Thanks. The game was not only political and military, but also cultural, with each empire attempting to co-opt or suppress local religious leaders, tribal authorities, and mystical societies that held sway in Central Asian societies. Where the occult intersects with the Great Game is far subtler, but nonetheless significant. Both empires had to grapple with the deeply spiritual cultures of Central Asia, Sufi brotherhoods, Tibetan Buddhist sects, shamanic traditions, and heterodox Islamic movements, just to name a few. British officers often cultivated relationships with mystics, fakirs, and lamas, not only to win influence, but also to gather intelligence under the cover of religious pilgrimage or ethnographic studies. The Russians, meanwhile, developed an interest in occult-adjacent practices as a way to probe the psychology of the populations they sought to control. For example, Russian explorers such as the also silly named, but he's foreign, so I'll let it slide, Gambojab Sibakov, a Buryat Buddhist, were dispatched to Tibet disguised as pilgrims, blending intelligence with esoteric credibility. Later, figures like Alexander Barchenko, who we'll get into much more later, would connect Central Asian mystical lore with early Soviet occult sciences, explicitly linking geopolitical exploration to esoteric research. This era of the so-called Great Game also provided one of the richest, far more vast and complex chapters within the intriguing centuries-old interconnectedness that exists betwixt intelligence and espionage agencies with occult beliefs, practices, and practitioners. By the turn of the 20th century, theosophy and other occult movements had also become entangled in the Great Game. Helena Blavatsky, herself Russian-born, drew heavily on Tibetan and Indian esoteric traditions, and her followers, both Russian and Western, were sometimes suspected of serving as informal intelligence conduits. In British India, intelligence services kept tabs on theosophists, both for their anti-colonial sympathies and for their deep involvement in local religious politics. Perhaps this explains certain fringe conspiracy theories surrounding whether or not Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society were in fact actually some form of Okhrana homunculus, though this is highly improbable. The Okhrana being the Tsarist Russian-era secret police, who we'll also get into more in just a moment. Conversely, Russian authorities were wary of occult fraternities like the Martinists and Rosicrucians, fearing that they could serve as secret channels for Western influence under the guise of metaphysics. During the Soviet period, remnants of this dynamic resurfaced within the NKVD, investigating mystics and occultists in border regions, suspicious that their otherworldly claims could mask espionage or political agitation. Thus, while occult groups were never considered central players in the great game, they were often drawn into its orbit, sometimes as unwitting informants, sometimes as useful intermediaries who could cross cultural and spiritual boundaries that conventional agents could not. Intelligence officers exploited occult or mystical identities as convenient disguises, while simultaneously surveilling esoteric movements as potential security risks. In that sense, the Great Game helped forge an early modern connection between secret societies, geopolitics, and espionage, a connection that would arguably culminate with World War II, then later reverberates in certain programs such as Paperclip, MKUltra, Soviet parapsychology, and American Cold War psychic warfare programs such as Stargate, Gondola Wish, etc., the various names it went under, or related programs and psyops which still exert a considerable influence on our modern era, as well as the very likely foreseeable future. When taking into consideration the overall occult history of the world, one can arguably fill an endless series of corkboards with red strings that connects the Imperial espionage concepts of John Dee to the ancient proto-MK-Ultra style drug-fueled super soldier programs of the Hashishans, Berserkers, or even Roman werewolf cults, just to name a few. It's in this episode that we will explore merely a portion of what we know and or can confirm to have occurred in just roughly the last 100 years. The turn of the 20th century saw a flourishing of esoteric currents within Russia's Silver Age of culture, roughly spanning the 1890s up to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Moscow and St. Petersburg salons blended symbolist literature, philosophy, and mysticism. Writers such as Andrei Bely, Vyacheslav Ivanov, and Alexander Blok infused their art with theosophical and anthroposophical motifs. Secret societies like the Martinists and Masonic-inspired lodges resurfaced in urban intellectual circles, while spiritualism remained fashionable among the aristocrats and reformist intelligentsia alike. Many enthusiasts attempted to use new scientific theories or discoveries, such as the fourth dimension or radio waves, to reframe unexplained phenomena, possibly creating a theoretical foundation of miscellaneous strange bullshit, eventually providing the required quote-unquote right, i.e. politically correct, frame of reference for such ideas during the Soviet era. The Silver Age also saw translations of Western occult texts circulate widely, and esoteric journals such as Vestnik Teosophy, Izvestia Martinistov, and perhaps Rebus being the most well-known, that attempted to marry mystical traditions with the Russian religious/philosophical Renaissance. Importantly, this milieu tied mystical speculation to political and cultural radicalism. Occult ideas were treated not only as private spiritual metaphysics, but as potential tools for social, evolutionary, and cultural radicalism. Radical dude. Occult ideas were treated not only as private spiritual metaphysics, but as potential tools for social, evolutionary, and civilizational transformation. These currents formed a cultural bridge from Blavatsky's earlier theosophy to the Roerich group, as well as Bolshevik-era mystico-political projects, which we'll also get into later. Ironically, it was also this type of social environment that would ultimately facilitate the strange uprising of one wild-eyed, quote-unquote, righteous sinner / magical backwoods fuckmaster that history remembers as Rasputin. Though there were certainly other such types of esoteric advisors to the imperial court before him, However, it's likely the reactions to such characters, particularly Rasputin, that would later inform a much more hostile interpretation of such, quote, decadent, futile bourgeoisie, ideologically masturbatory, morbid fascinations with superstitious mumbo-jumbo bullshit, unquote. To paraphrase what I'm 100% certain were the words of at least one young radical comrade back in them days. The mystical anarchists, which off the bat sounds cool as shit, probably embody the Silver Age's most explicit attempt to fuse esotericism with revolutionary politics. They cast the coming upheaval as both a religious apocalypse and a spiritual experiment, at once aesthetic, occult, and utopian. This outlook created a conceptual bridge to Bolshevism itself. Despite Marxism's official materialism, its language was one of moral absolutes. The movement carried its own missionary fervor, a secularized evangelism of worldwide historical destiny and redemption. For many within the Russian intelligentsia, mystical anarchism and symbolist religiosity provided the emotional and mythic scaffolding that Marxism alone could not supply. Both of them promised total transformation, one through ecstatic communion and esoteric revelation, the other through, oh God, boring dialectical struggle and quote-unquote class revolution. Anyways, in this sense, both Russia's Silver Age occult ferment and Marxism's quasi-religious zeal shared a millenarian horizon.
What I do? I didn't do nothing. What I do?
The conviction that a new humanity was at hand, and that history itself was a stage for spiritual as well as social transfiguration. However, it wasn't until after the 1917 October Revolution when the Bolsheviks would overthrow the provisional government and the subsequent bloody civil war between the Red and White armies ending in 1922 that soon a few of the original, more idealistic revolutionaries would eventually become disillusioned with their newly institutionalized and empowered fellow travelers, acting out their many petty grievances, paranoid intrigues, abuses of power, and outright mass political violence inspired by perceived class differences. And when the veneer of what they'd quote-unquote won had begun to wane. Then much later, a couple years later, along comes old Joseph, opiate of the masses Stalin, who later come to power, and for a while things got kind of fun and silly slapstick, but only for a moment. And this was likely due to a simple misunderstanding, as it was immediately followed by dull gray decades of the grim Soviet tattletale state, overrun with secret police, enhanced interrogation, paranoia, forced labor, starvation, gender equality, job security, and then eventually glorious union of Soviet Socialist republics. What, bitch? I saw light of right party thinking in detention center before end of sentence. Anyways, though a few of the original ride-or-die V.I. Lenin/Trotsky posse became disgusted with what they saw the revolution turning into, namely the massive violence culminating through these perceived class differences, a few of these guys, they had their doubts, but they sure as shit never openly voiced anything remotely resembling this opinion in any capacity, not if they had any sense of self-preservation, at least. We'll meet two such figures later on who, despite their party loyalty, idealism, and missionary zeal, were, perhaps unfortunately for Mother Russia, but most definitely very fucking unfortunate for them themselves personally, would suffer greatly from what was basically an inability to read the room. No, just kidding. It was Red Terror of Stalin's purges that fucking killed them. Well, technically, was bullet to back of skull, but you know what the fuck I mean. Ain't overish. But I get ahead of myself. By the way, thanks for putting up with my ridiculous, cartoony, Boris and Natasha style, quote-unquote, Russian accents. Now, most of this episode relates to or takes place in the context of what is known as Red Shambhala, a name/concept referring to a seemingly short-lived and mostly Bolshevik-era pursuit of proposed sociocultural/religious/historical and, more importantly, geopolitical roadmap that attempted to inextricably interlink Buddhism with state-sponsored communism, and interpreted as an inherently perfect and or predestined secular counterpart being deemed as the primary necessity required to finally manifest prophecies related to the Kala Chakra Tantra and its apocalyptic liberation theology, leading to the creation, manifestation, discovery, whatever you want to call it, of Shambhala as the eternal empire of the East, to stand in opposition to the West as they created a newly evolved and enlightened society of communist Buddhist superhumans in a scientific future utopia. So, quick spoiler alert, but obviously that shit didn't happen, at least not yet. So, despite the repeated failure of such ambitious plans, there were several attempts which exhibited various levels of success, some of them not even primarily the machinations of the state. This is a lesser known yet incredibly strange and fascinating chapter in history that's deftly told in the similarly titular book Red Shambhala by author Andrei Znamenski. Seriously, I read it in just a few hours. It was that level of gripping mixed with historical what-the-fuckness, and thus I most highly recommend it. Anyways, needless to say, when he wasn't distracted by internal political intrigues or inventing and practicing Photoshop, Stalin's ever-increasing paranoia and raging atheism likely provided a highly energized, bro, fuck that, as the official counterposition to this particular issue, and especially after the party finally realized that A, even if they used Buddhism to unite Red Mongolia and their various inner Asian native peoples, eventually each group would sooner or later likely embrace nationalism and eventually become a fucking problem. B, they mostly only wanted to fuck Tibet because England was fucking them first, but then they later found out it was only because they used to fuck China and didn't want them meddling with their currently fucking India. So they basically only started fucking Tibet since it was a buffer between the two. And C, because of what a fucking pain in the ass it would be repeatedly reconciling Marxist materialism with Buddhist beliefs every time it got brought up, when instead it's just way easier to either ignore or deport the more pain-in-the-ass Asiatic natives and make the Buddhists do daily meditations on pain and forced labor once they've all gone go-go gulag. And that last one was exactly the kind of cold, ruthless reasoning meets completely grim practicality behind how guys like the penoid psycho old Joseph Webtoes Stalin always seemingly end up running shit. Because there's little or no critical thinking required, or any endless debating over the moral or ethical concerns of your actions when you've got a strong leader in the driver's seat. Plus, most of all, it's just easier. It makes institutionalized evil and the committing of atrocities all just so much easier, you guys. Achieving true greatness takes hard work. Being a piece of shit is effortless. Having said that, there's a few people that I want to give some honorable mentions before we jump into things. People who play into this vast narrative but don't quite jibe the whole way through. So despite the ephemeral short-lived duration of Russia's now fabled Silver Age, once again, 1890s to 1920s, it was highly condensed with an immense number of intriguing people seeking out or creating their very own systems of existential engagement and inquiry, we'll call it. Working all of them into this particular series is impossible because there's so many, but other than our primary characters, there are a certain few who deserve quick honorable mentions. Presented in this following set of brief detailed bios are some of the more interesting or influential individuals, giving their backgrounds, occult or esoteric role and pedigree, as well as any potential intelligence agency or state connections they may have had. First up is the aforementioned Helena Blavatsky and Theosophy. Helena Blavatsky, born 1831, died 1891, was the founder of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky's influence in Russia was profound despite her years abroad. Her synthesis of Eastern mysticism, Western occultism, and spiritual evolution appealed to Russian intellectuals searching for alternatives to orthodoxy and Western rationalism. In the late Imperial period, Theosophy infiltrated aristocratic salons and some Masonic circles. Tsarist intelligence monitored its spread, fearing its potential to destabilize orthodoxy and fuel revolutionary currents cloaked in mysticism. Then you've also got Pappu, a.k.a. Gerard and Koss, born 1865, died 1916, and his esoteric movement, order, etc., called Martinism. Papus was a French physician/occultist who established Martinism as a quote-unquote Christianized form of esoteric initiation. He cultivated strong ties with Russian aristocrats, including members of the Romanov family, and maintained a close relationship with Tsar Nicholas II's court. Russian Martinists saw themselves as a spiritual counterweight to revolutionary forces, though the Okhrana, aka the Tsarist secret police, kept a wary eye on them. Papus' death in 1916 coincided with the collapse of the mystical court factions that surrounded Rasputin and the Empress. Then you've also got Maria Mamonova. Born roughly in the 1860s, died somewhere in the 1930s, she was an aristocrat and leading Russian theosophist who hosted salons in St. Petersburg where theosophy, spiritualism, and radical politics converged. She was reportedly under surveillance by the Okhrana for her networks linking occult seekers with liberal revolutionaries. Watch out. Mamonova's circle also served as a bridge between esotericism and women's emancipation movements, and she later became a respected figure among émigré occultists in Paris. Yet another one of the many contemporary parapolitical or esoteric associations which existed betwixt France and Tsarist Russia. There's quite a few. Strange. And then, once again, we've got the aforementioned Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, born 1886, died, murdered 1921. The Bloody Baron, a white Russian general in Mongolia, fused brutal militarism with Buddhist mysticism and apocalyptic visions. He styled himself as a reincarnated warrior king destined to restore monarchy and crush Bolshevism. Ungern was fascinated by Tibetan and Mongol occult traditions and consulted Buddhist lamas. He earned an infamous reputation for cruelty, occasionally even towards his own men if they were considered insubordinate. More than anything, though, it was his often impractical insistence upon slaughtering black Russians, quote-unquote, which is an inter-Asian term used for Slavic Jews at the time, that drew greatly confused ire from the likes of his men. His attempts to establish a theocratic empire in Mongolia collapsed in 1921 when he was captured and executed by the Red Army, but his legend as a mad bastard lives on in esoteric and far-right circles. Yay. Then you've got Dr. Pyotr Buddha Badmaev, born circa 1850, died 1920. He was a Buryat, which is a local Asian ethnicity. Most of the Asian/Russian ethnicities can trace their roots back to Mongolia for the most part. But he was a Buryat physician trained in Tibetan medicine who was simultaneously a court doctor to the Imperial family, an occult healer, and an intelligence operative, go figure. He introduced Russian elites to Tibetan herbal remedies and esoteric Buddhist teachings. Badmaev was rumored to have advised Rasputin and possibly the Okhrana, positioning himself as both a healer and a political fixer. His home became a hub for mystics, revolutionaries, and spies. He quite shrewdly survived through the revolution to continue exerting his influence and commanding reverence from prominent levels of the state apparatus. And finally, we've got Nicholas and Helena Roerich, 1874 to 1947, 1879 to 1955, respectively. The Roerichs blended theosophy with their own esoteric teaching of Agni Yoga, Agni being the Hindu god of fire. Nicholas, a painter/mystic/potential proto-LARPer or possibly even spy, sought to create a spiritual/cultural movement linking Russia, India, and Central Asia. In the 1920s to 30s, the Roerichs engaged with both Soviet and Western intelligence during their Central Asian expeditions, we'll call them, which mixed mystical quests with geopolitical maneuvering, the so-called Shambhala project, as they referred to it. They remain central to Russian esoteric thought and are celebrated even today in post-Soviet Russia. The Roerichs provided the culture/politics context for why occult Asia, quote-unquote, occult Asia, mattered to early Bolshevik strategists. His wife, Helena Roerich, was also either a quote-unquote spirit medium, mentally ill, or possibly even both. She was the original conduit through which the Roerichs both began communicating with and taking instructions from their mysterious disembodied spiritual advisor / taskmaster Mahatma Moria of Ascended Masters fame. They'd also end up somehow bestowed ownership of the so-called magical artifact known as the Chintamani Stone. They'd also dragged their poor son George into their esoteric quests of predestined greatness, while in the process also forcing him to forever sever ties with the only woman he's ever loved, because he's meant to be dedicated to a greater cause, i.e., his father's shenanigans. During the second expedition, which was funded by the United States, old Nicky would make a few statements he was very much unauthorized to make, in the process embarrassing himself and the United States, and this would later cause great embarrassment, especially for the Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt, Henry A. Wallace, who went from referring to Roerich as my guru in various writings to having completely ruined his political career, and it was slightly promising one at that. Later declassified documentation would reveal that during much of the Roerich's 2 expeditions, Nicholas Roerich's brother Boris was quote-unquote unofficially being held in custody by the state. So make of this what you will. Their most lasting contribution to history is likely the Roerich Pact. This was an international treaty seeking the safety and preservation of various religious and historically important forms of art and artifacts. Unfortunately, there's not enough time here to get too deep into their story, which is why I once again strongly recommend reading the book Red Shambhala by Andrei Znamenski, because I've just barely covered much of the surface level events here, and it covers more of the operations and manipulations of prophecy and belief. And best of all, it's a quick, intriguing, and highly compelling read that covers a much slept-on episode of weird history. But what you can see across this particular list is that occultism in pre-Soviet and early Soviet Russia never sat in isolation. It was entangled with aristocracy, revolutionary politics, and state intelligence. Figures like Blavatsky, Badmaev, and the Roerichs blurred the lines between spiritual quest, social protest, and covert statecraft. Now, pardon me, I've got this a little bit out of chronological order. Let's see here. Okay, so jumping right into one of the larger portions of the Imperial Tsarist Russian era, we have the Department for the Protection of Public Safety and Order, commonly abbreviated in modern English sources as the Okhrana, or the Guard, which was the secret police force of the Russian Empire and part of the police department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or MVD, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, aided by the Special Corps of Gendarmes. A lot of French crossover, certain things. I don't know, it's weird. The cultural osmosis taking place. The Okhrana was formed to combat political terrorism and left-wing politics. Whoa, look out! Look out for them left-wing politics, they'll get you. And revolutionary activity. The Okhrana operated offices throughout the Russian Empire, as well as satellite agencies in a number of foreign countries. France. The Okhrana deployed multiple methods, including assassination, clandestine and covert operations, counterintelligence, espionage, human intelligence, manhunt for the capture or kill of high-value targets, and a new word I learned, perlustration. Sounds sinister, doesn't it? It's the reading of private correspondences. So, after that, I mean, yes, it's still sinister, but not so much. The Okhrana's foreign agency also monitored revolutionary activity. While their primary mission was political policing, their quote-unquote rogues gallery did end up including mystical, occult, and esoteric currents because of their overlap with sectarianism, Freemasonry, and revolutionary culture. As far as their various interactions with various occult groups, here's what can be assembled from archival references, trial records, and secondary scholarship. First up, we've got the Theosophical Society, the Russian sections. They were surveilled due to foreign-rooted links to Freemasonry and spiritualism and accused of corrupting youth and, quote-unquote, sapping orthodoxy. There were reports on Moscow and St. Petersburg lodges from the 1900s and 1910s, censorship of Russian translation of Blavatsky and her predecessor, Andy Besant, and known infiltration of the 1908 to 1913 Petrograd circles. Key figures watched were Anna Kamenskaya, a leading Russian theosophist with ties to Besant's India movements. Next up were the Martinist and occult Freemasons, who were surveilled because of their secret initiations, ties to French occult lodges, and possible political undercurrents. The Okhrana actions involved used files opened on Paput, who traveled to St. Petersburg and personally initiated Russian aristocrats. There was surveillance of Martinist lodges in Moscow, especially those tied to imperial court circles, and police informants flagged occult seances with magical political overtones, likely delusional. A lot of this is paranoia. Some of this you got to take with a grain of salt. Nicholas II himself flirted with joining the Martinist order, which made the Okhrana extra anxious. And then you have the various spiritualist and medium circles who were surveilled due to crossover with the liberal intelligentsia. Gatherings were seen as possible covers for political meetings. There were raids on seance groups in Moscow and Odessa from 1909 to 1912. Confiscation of quote-unquote automatic writing texts, accused of seducing young women into hysteria, quote-unquote. Those young women always getting hysterical. There were psychiatric evaluations ordered for prominent mediums, cases where seances were used to cloak underground publishing salons, at least in the eyes of the Okhrana. And then next up, you've got the Kalisti and Skoptsi. Skoptsi? Make sure I say that right. Skoptsi, these mystical sects. These were long considered quote-unquote dangerous heresies by church and state, some members drifting into political radicalism. Surveillance intensified after Rasputin's rise, since he was linked, whether rightly or wrongly, to the Kalisti sect. Alleged orgiastic rites and rituals, etc. Mass arrests of sex gatherings, especially in the Tambov and Tver areas. Reports describe quote-unquote erotic orgies under the guise of mystic ecstasy, a favorite propaganda trope. It should also be noted that the Skoptsi were a group of autocastrati. That's right, chopping off willies. From orgiastic rites to chopping off willies, Imperial Russia, a land of extremes. You also have intelligence efforts looking into the Rosicrucians and esoteric Christian groups, small but fashionable among Silver Age intellectuals and often linked to foreign lodges. They targeted individuals like Alexei Solovyov's Rosicrucian circles in Moscow during the 1910s. Informants noted overlap with symbolist poets and artists, and considered mostly apolitical but morally corrosive, according to the Okhrana. Once again, another large, I would say, occult, philosophical, esoteric overlap with French movements. The symbolist movement was largely born in the context that the Russians were participating in it, from a man named Joseph Peladon, who basically was a Rosicrucian artist, but he was very much kind of like the, I don't know, a cross between Prince and Lady Gaga of his time, but he was also like an Andy Warhol type figure, I guess, and was very much into the curation and promotion of symbolist art movements. And then there were various other occult-tinged revolutionary mystics, or quote-unquote mystics. Some radical intelligentsia mixed mysticism with revolutionary politics. There's pre-existing files on Alexander Barchenko, later famous for expeditions with Gleb Boki, who we'll get into big time later. Oh, man, some of these names. I know they're foreign. Just, man, just still. Oh, silly foreigners. All right. But yes, Barchenko was already flagged in the 1910s as a, quote, dangerous occultist with political designs. They also kept watch on religious anarchists, followers of Lev Cherny, who mixed mysticism with anarchism. The Okhrana blurred lines between occult sect and revolutionary cell if the group's esoteric language covered politics in any way. And then there were various foreign esoteric orders. Russian aristocrats joining international orders made the regime nervous. Dossiers exist on foreign correspondence with Amorc, or the Rosicrucian group, which I believe started in America, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and OTO figures, though no large-scale Russian presence is ever confirmed, at least not in this era. German occult organizations may mask Masonic or revolutionary conspiracies. This was the concern of the Okhrana, and there's a little evidence to back some of this up. Nonviolent sects in the mystical anarchist / Tolstoyan esoteric vein, I guess you'd call it. These were nonviolent sects blending mysticism, vegetarian communes, and apocalyptic visions. They were treated as potential seedbeds of rebellion, even when mostly pacifist. But there were patterns in the Okhrana treatment of occultism. Suspicion by default. Anything non-orthodox equals foreign subversion. Overlap with politics. Occult groups became prime targets if mixed with radicalism, salons, or publishing. Propaganda angles. Rituals were portrayed in press reports as obscene or insane. Framing mysticism, once again, as socially dangerous. Punitive psychiatry, once again. Double standards, such as aristocratic lodges, like the Martinists with their imperial court ties, were surveilled but not destroyed, while plebeian sects, the shit munchers, were harshly persecuted. So while the Okhrana did not create any of these occult movements, as some have previously theorized, especially regarding theosophy, they did keep thick-ass dossiers on them, often portraying them as quote-unquote corrupting influences that distracted or deranged the intelligentsia. In some cases, once again, like with theosophy, they tolerated small circles because it was preferable to Marxist agitation, which they knew was going to be a big problem coming up in the not-too-distant future. Now, while the Okhrana has become notorious for its agent provocateurs, in the world of the occult and fringe beliefs, it is perhaps most well-known, though unfortunately not quite well-known enough, apparently, for having created and distributed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of history's most damaging and notorious anti-Semitic forgeries. The hoax was designed to blame Jews for Russia's problems and to discredit revolutionary movements by framing them as part of a, you guessed it, vast Jewish conspiracy for world domination. Dun dun dun. The Okhrana operated in a Tsarist Russia plagued by political instability and rising revolutionary sentiment. So rather than addressing the government's failures, the secret police and other reactionary forces sought a scapegoat to redirect public discontent, ultimately targeting the Jewish population. Through its precise authorship is disputed, many historians believe Okhrana agent Matvey Golovinsky forged the protocols in Paris again, around 1903. The text was largely plagiarized from earlier non-Jewish works, including 1. A Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, which was an 1864 French satire critical of Napoleon III, as well as Biarritz, an 1868 novel by German anti-Semite Hermann Goethe. The forgery was first published in Russia in a 1903 newspaper owned by the anti-Semite Pavel Khrushchevan. It gained a wider audience in 1905 when it was included as an appendix in a book by the Russian mystic Sergei Nihilus, who presented the text as genuine evidence of a satanic Jewish plot. The Okhrana used the protocols to sow discord and provide an ideological basis for the persecution of Jews. Nicholas II himself was impressed by the document, writing in his copy, quote, "All of this is undoubtedly genuine. The destructive hand of Jewry is everywhere," unquote. Jewry, blah, blah. You're going to hear me go from Russian to Dracula several times. Can't be helped. The Okhrana's forging of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the early 20th century wasn't just a random act of bigotry. It was a calculated piece of political technology designed to shore up a fragile autocracy. A few key reasons behind this action include scapegoating to protect the regime. Russia, under Tsar Nicholas II, was riddled with unrest, rapid industrialization, strikes, worker strikes, famine, revolutionary agitation. The Okhrana needed a convenient scapegoat to redirect popular anger away from the Tsarist state and its failures. Sounds a lot like America today. By framing Jews as part of a sinister world conspiracy, the secret police manufactured an enemy within, that ordinary Russians could blame for their suffering, rather than the incompetence of those in charge. Kind of sounds like America today. Quick note of clarification, just replace Jew with leftist, etc. I think you understand what I'm saying. Revolutionary groups, such as socialists, anarchists, Marxists, etc., were gaining traction, especially among the urban working class. Many Jews were active in left-wing circles, the Bunds, for example. So anti-Semitic propaganda could discredit revolutionaries by associating them with a quote-unquote global Jewish cabal. The protocols implied that revolutionary movements weren't organic struggles, but tools of a hidden conspiracy, undermining their legitimacy in the eyes of the wider population. Not only this, but another aspect that kind of sounds like America today. It weaponized conspiracy thinking. The text was built to resonate with a public already steeped in folklore, apocalyptic thinking, and fear of secret societies such as the Freemasons, Illuminati, etc. And by fusing those tropes with anti-Semitism, the Okhrana produced a universal conspiracy theory that was easily adaptable even beyond Russia. Pogroms, stoked by anti-Semitic propaganda, fractured solidarity between Jews, peasants, and workers, groups that might have otherwise united in revolutionary struggle. Keeping different social groups suspicious of one another is a classic tool of imperial governments, one that's still very much in vogue with many of today's shitty rulers. Ironically, while the protocols began as a czarist internal security tool, its afterlife became far bigger. White Russian immigrants fleeing the revolution, and just for the record, white Russian means pro-imperial, pro-monarchy. But the white Russian immigrants fleeing the revolution spread it across Europe and the US, where it mutated into a global conspiracy meme that is still alive today. The Okhrana weaponized anti-Semitism and conspiracy thinking to deflect class anger, discredit revolutionaries, and protect autocracy. It was a crude but effective way of making sure people blamed, quote-unquote, the Jews instead of the Tsar. It was exposed as a fraud in 1921 when the London Times provided the definitive public exposure of the protocols as a forgery by revealing its extensive plagiarism of the 1864 French satire mentioned above. This was later corroborated by court cases in both Switzerland and Russia. Despite being repeatedly and conclusively discredited, the protocols has had a devastating and enduring impact. The Nazis used it as propaganda to justify the persecution and genocide of European Jews during the Holocaust. And it continues to be circulated by anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists worldwide and is used to spread hatred against the Jewish people. Now, while there are or have been certain Jewish groups who've said or done horrible shit, Lev Tahor, Katch, or Hilltop Youth being more recent examples, it's largely because sooner or later, on a long enough timeline, any identity, be it race, religion, nationality, a preference for pleated khakis, etc., can be weaponized for violent or exclusionary purposes. And B, in someone's eyes, we've all done horrible shit. We're humans. We're stupid, brutal creatures, seemingly predisposed to grandiose delusions, attributing greater significance to damn near every fleeting thought, deed, or belief we excrete into being amidst our short-lived blip of existence within an infinite, empty cosmos. So hey, maybe just fucking relax. Don't be a dick. Have some understanding. Try to treat each other a little better. That's my Jerry Springer thought for the day. It should be noted, however, that the damage caused by this particular spurious text has been a bit excessive, to say the least, with its creation, release, and inexplicable historical persistence, intentionally exploiting a pre-existing condition of centuries-old anti-Semitic scapegoating, basically making the protocols one of the OG prototype psyops, one that people, lots of people, all too readily and easily bought into, hook, line, and stinker. The Okhrana's fabrication of the protocols shows an early Russian template, conspiracy and myth-making weaponized to redirect unrest, fracture solidarity, and bolster the regime's power. This reliance on fabricated unseen enemies provided a political technology of perception management. What mattered wasn't whether the myth was true, but whether it structured popular imagination in a way useful to the state, more or less. When the Bolsheviks came to power, they officially denounced occultism and religion as bourgeois superstition. Bourgeois! Yet the missionary zeal of Marxism functioned in strikingly similar terms. Totalizing worldview, eschatological in tone, with a promised end to history and salvation through revolution. And like orthodoxy before it, Marxism/Leninism sought to remake minds, reframe reality, and interpret anomalies through its ideological lens. By the mid-20th century, the Soviet security organs inherited both traditions. The Okhrana's paranoia-driven manipulation of invisible plots, now retooled for Cold War conditions, where rumors of secret American psychotronic weapons or CIA mind control programs could be weaponized as much as investigated. Marxism's quasi-religious drive to penetrate hidden truths of history and human potential, which gave a secular framework for exploring psi, telepathy, and parapsychology, not as superstition, but as scientific weapons that might give socialism an edge. Thus, the lineage is clear. From forged texts to psychic research, the Russian state repeatedly turned to the management of the invisible, whether conspiracies, spirits, or thought waves, as part of its struggle for control. Now, much of this episode is going to relate to or take place in the context of what is called Red Shambhala, a name/concept referring to a seemingly short-lived and mostly Bolshevik pursuit of proposed sociocultural/religious/historical and, most importantly, geopolitical roadmap that attempted to inextricably interlink Buddhism with state-sponsored communism, interpreted as an inherently perfect and or predestined secular counterpart, being deemed as the primary necessity required to finally manifest prophecies related to the Kalachakra Tantra in Tibetan Buddhism and its apocalyptic liberation theology, leading to the creation, manifestation, discovery, whatever you want to call it, of Shambhala as the eternal empire of the East, to stand in opposition to the West as they create a newly evolved and enlightened society of commie Buddhist superhumans in a scientific future utopia. So, quick spoiler alert, but obviously that shit didn't happen, at least not yet. Despite the repeated failure of such ambitious plans, there were several attempts which exhibited various levels of success, some of them not even primarily the machinations of the state. At least, we don't think so. This is a lesser-known yet incredibly strange and fascinating chapter in history that's deftly told in the similarly titular book, Red Shambhala, by author Andrei Znamenski. Seriously, I read it in just a few hours. It was that level of gripping, mixed with historical what-the-fuckness, and thus I must highly recommend it. Anyway, needless to say, when he wasn't distracted by internal political intrigues or inventing and practicing Photoshop, Stalin's ever-increasing paranoia and raging atheism likely provided a highly energized "bro, fuck that" as the official counterposition to this particular issue, and especially after the party finally realized that A, even if they used Buddhism to unite Red Mongolia and their various inner Asian native peoples, eventually each group would sooner or later likely embrace nationalism and eventually become a fucking problem. B, they mostly only wanted to fuck Tibet because England was already fucking them first, but then they later found out it was only because they used to fuck China, England, and didn't want them meddling with how they were currently fucking India, so they basically only started fucking Tibet since it was a buffer zone between the two. And C, because of what a fucking pain in the ass it would be to repeatedly reconcile Marxist materialism with Buddhist beliefs every time it got brought up, when instead it's just way easier to either ignore or deport the more pain-in-the-ass Asiatic natives and make the Buddhists do daily meditations on pain and forced labor once they've all gone go-go gulag. And that last one is exactly the kind of cold, ruthless reasoning meets completely grim practicality behind how guys like the Pinoid psycho Joseph Webtoes Stalin always seemingly end up running shit. Because there's little or no critical thinking required, or any endless debating over the moral or ethical concerns of your actions when you've got a strong leader in the driver's seat. Plus, most of all, it's just easier. It makes institutionalized evil and the committing of atrocities all just so much easier, you guys. Achieving true greatness takes hard work. Being a piece of shit is totally effortless. That's another Jerry Springer thought for the day. So, Kala Chakra Tantra, what is it? I've mentioned it before several times on this show. The Kala Chakra Tantra, or Wheel of Time Tantra, is one of the most complex, esoteric, and politically charged tantric traditions in Tibetan Buddhism. It sits at the intersection of mysticism, astrology, and millenarian prophecy. And yeah, there's some secret, sex magic shit going on in the background. Once again, the combination of seminal fluid and menses, it just keeps showing up. I'm starting to think there's more and more to it. And I've also had a personal weird experience that I will never share with anyone, but there's something to it. So, Kala Chakra, it means wheel of time or cycles of time. The Tantra is thought to have been composed in India around the 10th, 11th century CE, during a period of turbulence marked between conflicts between Buddhist and Islamic powers. There has been a certain contextual reframing of the Kala Chakra Tantra through time. Much of the original context revolves around the conflict with Islamic forces that were present at the time, and the Buddhists were sort of disappearing as a belief system. So the text claims to originate from a place called Shambhala, a semi-mythical Buddhist kingdom where the Buddha himself is said to have transmitted the secret teachings to King Suchandra. Now, the philosophical framework, there's basically, because it's a tantra, there are the outer teachings, the inner teachings, and the other teachings. Now, if I can put this as best as I can, I will say that most of the lurid sexual ritual details largely come from the source of Victor and Victoria Tremonti and their book In the Shadow of the Dalai Lama, which has been called by many people a spiritual conspiracy theory. It does seem very, let's say, sensationalist as far as like looking into the supposed sexual rituals that go on behind a lot of this stuff. But I've also heard that it's fairly accurate in its representation of many of these rituals being written at a time when women were considered very subservient to the entire tantric practice. So just take it with a grain of salt. It needs seasoning. But basically, the outline is this. The outer teachings cover cosmology and astronomy. They map cycles of time, like cosmic ages, the Kalpas, or the Kali Yuga, for example, astrological movements, lunar and solar calendars, and aligning external time cycles with inner human experience. It contains detailed instructions on astrology, mathematics, medicine, and calendar making, etc. And then you have the inner teachings, which basically bridge the macrocosm of the cosmos to the human body. So the microcosm of the human body, and describes the body as such, as a smaller version of existence, of the universe. And it discusses various channels, or nadi, winds, or prana, and drops, or bindu, oh, I'm a child, and cycles of breath, etc. There's yogic and tantric sexual practices that aim to control all of these and to help the practitioner transcend time and death. And then there's the other / alternative higher and secret initiations and yogic practices of advanced tantric meditation involving visualizing each other as deities or mandalas, basically taking on the spiritual guise of one of their gods and goddesses who are then joined in sexual union. And there's the Kalachakra deity, which is a multi-armed, wrathful, yet compassionate figure that represents time cycles transcended. And the ultimate goal is to realize the non-duality of time and timelessness, or samsara and nirvana. Some of the more lurid sexual aspects referred to, well, once again, I'm going to say, read Red Shambhala. If you're really interested in that aspect of stuff, read the Tremondi's In the Shadow of the Dalai Lama. Once again, take it, don't take it at face value, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that they talk about. And supposedly they got a lot of their information from translating various ancient texts that had the ritual sex practices like encoded into them. And that's another reason why it's like encoded. Well, then how can you be sure? I don't know. Once again, I've heard mixed feelings from actual like Tibetan Buddhists even on that particular text. But, once again, read the books. I'm not going to get into it here. But once again, I'll say seminal fluid, menstrual fluid. They just keep showing up. Anyways, so there's highly elaborate initiation rituals, and it's considered one of the most demanding initiations in Tibetan Buddhism. There's mandala construction, which is usually built out of sand, colored sand, to represent the Kalachakra cosmos, which is painstakingly created. And then there are empowerment initiations, which visualize the practitioner entering the mandala and becoming the deity Kalachakra itself, breaking identification with ordinary time-bound existence. The Dalai Lama today frequently gives Kalachakra initiations to tens of thousands, usually hundreds of people at a time. Just the first open, easily accessible, public parts of the ritual, as far as we know, of the few tantric empowerments widely offered to the public. This is one of them. Now, as I said, it's been recontextualized through history, and more often than not, these initiations and meditations are given in the name of world peace. Once again, you have to keep in mind that many religious texts are written within the context of where they come from and what was happening around them as they were written. Unfortunately, a lot of modern day religions don't fucking keep this in mind. And we have geopolitical and genocidal madmen and problems and things that every nature that pop out of this. So also with Kalachakra Tantra, there is a messianic dimension to this. One of the most famous is the aspect of the Shambhala prophecy. Shambhala, for those who don't know, is a hidden kingdom in Central Asia where the Kalachakra teachings are preserved in their purest form. It's ruled by a line of enlightened kings called Kulika or Rigden, and the prophecy states that in the future, when the world declines into chaos and non-Buddhist forces, often interpreted as Islamic invaders in the original text, dominate the world. The 25th king of Shambhala will emerge, and he will lead an apocalyptic battle to defeat the forces of darkness and usher in a golden age of universal enlightenment. This millenarian war narrative was unusual for Buddhist texts, to say the least, and reflects, once again, the turbulent religious political climate of medieval India. The prophecy has been read politically in Tibet, Mongolia, and even Russia, which we'll be getting into momentarily. Tsarist and Soviet explorers, theosophists like Blavatsky and the Roriks, and later Western esotericists connected Shambhala to hidden masters or ascended masters, secret chiefs, etc., guiding history from behind the curtains. Tibetan elites sometimes invoke the Shambhala myth to bolster legitimacy or morale in times of crisis. It was brought from Tibet around 1027 CE, which became year one of their Kalachakra calendar. It was championed by various translators and scholars of Tibetan Buddhism. It's especially important to certain schools that were politically suppressed in the 17th century, but the Kalachakra practices persisted. The Dalai Lama's role, since the 1950s, he's given these large-scale Kalachakra initiations as a gesture of world peace. So this frames it less as an apocalyptic battle, more as a symbolic empowerment for harmony. Nicholas Roerich linked Shambhala to hidden masters guiding human evolution. There's a cult fascination with Tibet that often borrows from Kalachakra and Shambhala motifs, and various scholars have looked at it in the broader sense of occult Russia and Asian geopolitics. It's philosophically vast, centered on cosmology, psychology, and soteriology, or, what's going to save us in the apocalypse, soteriology, savior-related type shit. Practically, as a practice, that is, it's advanced. It's very demanding tantric yoga. It's politically charged with apocalyptic prophecies of Shambhala, and it's also culturally enduring, bridging Tibetan religion, modern geopolitics, and Western esotericism. It embodies a Buddhist vision of the cosmic struggle and ultimate liberation, blending mysticism with prophetic history in a way that has inspired and unsettled generations across Asia and beyond. Now, some of the other stuff I wanted to look at before we get into the major Red Shambhala aspect of this episode. There's a convergence of spiritualism, occult practices, and state paranoia in Russia from the late Imperial period through the 1930s. It focuses on what more or less is the small sources of occult crime that took place. Russian spiritualism gained traction in the late 19th century, often influenced by French and British seances and theosophy. By 1910, Moscow and St. Petersburg had thriving networks of mediumistic circles, and essentially even something akin to ghost bro culture. Parallel to the development of this movement was the growing popularity of the mystically inclined symbolist movement amongst artists and the literati. Some key movements, once again, include Martinism, with both strong symbolist and czarist connections, Russian theosophy, linked to figures like the man we'll get into later, Gleb Boki, old Gleb Boki, Rosicrucian offshoots, and esoteric Christian mysticism, i.e. the orgiastic Klisti sect, to which Rasputin has been connected, or the Skoptsy sect of Otto Kastratai. Once again, Tsarist Russia, a land of extremes. Many of these groups combine mysticism with nationalist or racial utopianism. Some fringe offshoots advocated ritual purification, apocalyptic visions, or the violent cleansing of society. And hey, wouldn't you know it, much of that exact same shit is still going on in Russia to this very day, because we don't learn. As far as, its connection to esoteric groups. So, before we jump into the the meat and potatoes, the Boki and Barchenko crew, there's a few cases I wanted to mention. There's the Mikhail Kostrov Black Mass scandal that took place in Moscow in 1908. A student by the name of Mikhail Kostrov was arrested after rumors spread that he and a small group performed a black mass in a Moscow apartment, allegedly desecrating icons and using blood. Reported in Moscow press at the Times, notably Moskovsky Vedomosti, the affair scandalized the conservative public and was cited in clerical critiques of the symbolist/decadent youth. Likely exaggerated as a moral panic around youthful occult experimentation and blasphemous theatrics, it was framed as a criminal sacrilege under Orthodox law, not as quote-unquote Satanism per se. There were various occultist and quote-unquote immorality prosecutions, which is a general pattern between 1905 to roughly 1916-ish, before the Bolshevik Revolution, definitely. Russian symbolist salons, theosophical circles, and erotic mystical cults sometimes drew police raids. The pretext was usually blasphemy against orthodoxy, fraud, fortune-telling and mediumship, largely, moral corruption, sex scandals involving quote-unquote tantric or occult groups. These are discussed in books like The Occult in Russian and Soviet Culture by Bernice Glatzer-Rosenthal and Maria Carlson's No Religion Higher Than Truth, A History of the Theosophical Movement in Russia, 1875 to 1922. Now, one of the main parts I wanted to get into this was to mention the occult madness at the Kazan State Asylum. This is a psychiatric, Psychiatric journals describe at least 11 cases of young women institutionalized after practicing self-starvation, automatic writing, or spiritual possession, quote unquote, in various ritual contexts. This is also, once again, the onset of punitive psychiatry, so state punishment, weaponization of psychiatry, etc. Many of these women believe themselves to be vessels of divine intelligence or martyrs of the quote-unquote New Age. Some exhibited stigmata-like symptoms, self-inflicted, or attempted ritual suicide, and at least 3 cases involved attempted infanticide, which were luckily intercepted by family or neighbors. This one's particularly eerie, I suppose, because it shows how occult practice, apocalyptic belief, and early Soviet psychiatry collided in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. It's also the beginnings of what would come to be known as, once again, punitive psychiatry, weaponization of psychiatry by the state. So Kazan was a provincial but intellectual hub and had a strong pre-revolutionary mystical subculture. There were theosophists, Tolstoyans, sectarians, and folk Christian/esoteric groups out the yin-yang. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, censorship collapsed for a while, and a flood of millenarian sects and amateur occult groups flourished, often blending spiritualism, folk orthodoxy, and apocalypticism. Kazan State Asylum, like many provincial asylums, became a repository for cases where mystical experiences crossed into violent or self-destructive behavior. Certain cases reported in the psychiatric literature, such as Kazan State Psychiatric Society journals from 1920 to 1923, and later anthologized in Soviet psychiatric casebooks as an example of quote-unquote religious mania, include, and now keep in mind these are psychiatric texts, so they're not going to have the full name of the people. These are just alleged examples of what was taking place due to the newly reframed psychiatric take on religious or spiritual practice. So there's the case of In, a woman aged 19 years old. In 1919, she was a seamstress who had joined a small women's mystical prayer circle. She practiced ritual fasting, claiming, "The angels will feed me." She developed hallucinations of a burning sun inside her chest, attempted to cut stigmata into her palms with sewing needles during an ecstatic trance. Neighbors even intervened when she tried to leap from a window to ascend to the heavenly throne, quote unquote. She was diagnosed with religious melancholia progressing to schizophrenia. And we've got the case of M, age 22, in 1920. A young mother, literate, she had attended seances before the revolution and claimed she was, quote, a vessel for Sophia, the divine wisdom, unquote. She began compulsively writing automatic script in mixed Russian and gibberish. She attempted ritual drowning of her infant daughter in the Volga River to, quote-unquote, baptize her in fire and water, unquote. Luckily, she was stopped by relatives. And later interned at Kazan Asylum. Journals note her as an example of dangerous mystical autosuggestion. There's the case of V, age 17, in 1921. This is an orphan girl raised in a convent school before its closure. She fell in with a small group influenced by theosophical pamphlets left behind by emigres. Developed convictions that she was a child martyr of the New Age, which, to a degree, she's kind of right, I guess, seeing what happened to her. But she was destined to die for the coming spiritual kingdom. That part, not so much. She starved herself, drank only holy water, and carved crosses into her arms. She collapsed during a group fast and was taken to the asylum, and records note that she suffered from persistent hallucinations of luminous beings. The reason I include these is because it's interesting to me the suppression of religious and spiritual practices that came after the Bolshevik Revolution, for the most part. We'll get into why this is not always the case, but once you hit Soviet era, then it's like, oh shit, like don't even fucking mention any of that stuff or you're fucked. But I don't know, it's like things like bumped up a notch, like big time after they were saying like no more of this religious bullshit, state atheism all the way, and just what the sort of whether intentional or not reaction to it was. So continuing on, there's the case of A, age 25, 1922, a teacher, well-read, described as quote-unquote a nervous type. Oh no. She wrote voluminous trance diaries of conversations with, quote, beings from Venus and Mars, unquote, mixing theosophy with spiritualist imagery. She became violent during a psychotic break, accusing her neighbors of being demons, tried to set fire to her boarding house in a purification rite, and was committed under diagnosis of progressive paranoia with mystical content. Now, automatic writing was noted in at least 5 cases, often influenced by earlier exposure to spiritualism, the practices therein. Self-starvation and ritual fasting were the most common features, sometimes ending in severe malnutrition. Stigmata-like wounds, needle punctures, knife carvings of crosses, once again self-inflicted, were described with fascination by physicians. And infanticide attempts. At least 3 young women tried to kill children, quote-unquote, sacrificially, were stopped before the deaths occurred. Now, the psychiatrists framed these as hallucinatory psychoses born of mystical superstition. And later, Soviet psychiatric writings, roughly in the 1930s, cited these cases to argue that, quote, religious survivals, unquote, were socially dangerous. They're partially right. This cluster became a cautionary tale in Soviet psychiatry, showing how occult or esoteric belief was pathologized as mental illness. It reinforced the early Bolshevik view that mysticism and sectarianism were not just, quote-unquote, superstition, but a breeding ground for madness and criminal danger. Once again, they're partially right. These cases were repeatedly cited in propaganda campaigns against folk Christianity, theosophy, and decadent bourgeois mysticism. So, while individual case details come only from the medical journals, which of course are written with heavy ideological bias after 1920, the patterns of ritual self-harm, attempts at child sacrifice, and automatic writing, it's consistently reported throughout these particular selections. It's one of the best documented intersections of occult practice, psychiatry, and violence in post-revolutionary Russia. Now, the Russian Silver Age produced an explosion of occult experimentation, but verified criminal cases tend to be prosecutions for blasphemy, fraud, or sexual misconduct rather than sorcery trials in the older European sense. The line between avant-garde cultural provocations, such as symbolist theater, the decadent salons, and criminalized, quote-unquote, ritual crimes was blurry and often inflated by conservative press or orthodox authorities. You throw the Okhrana in that mix as well, and things are going to get blown out of proportion, I'm sure. But these cases foreshadow how the Soviet state later equated mystical groups with counter-revolutionary conspiracies. Now, before we get, once again, into our main topic for this episode, the Boki and Barchenko crew, there are some post-Soviet occult crimes that I wanted to cover because some of these are just interesting. Some are flat-out fucking hilarious, to be honest, but some are really fucked up. So, we've got the satanic cult murders in Ekaterinburg from 1997 to 1999. In the late 1990s, a series of ritualistic murders in Ekaterinburg, Russia, led to the conviction of 8 individuals. The accused were alleged members of a satanic cult. The members were described as taking part in occult rituals. The case garnered significant media attention, sparking debates about the existence of satanic cults in Russia and the potential for moral panics, because they didn't get to have their satanic panic while we were doing it. So some observers questioned whether these accused were truly involved in Satanism or if they were victims of a witch hunt. It's probably a little from column A, a little from column B. Now, this one I particularly love. Alexander Gabashev, the shaman who set out to exorcise Vladimir Putin in 2019. The 2019 Siberian shaman Alexander Gabashev embarked on a journey from Yakutsk to Moscow, claiming he would expel President Vladimir Putin, whom he described as a demon. Gabashev's trek attracted media attention and a following of supporters. However, authorities detained him, citing public calls for extremist activity, and placed him in a psychiatric facility. There's also Ashram Shambhala. It was founded in 1989 by Konstantin Rudnev in Novosibirsk. Ashram Shambhala was a religious sect that combined occult and esoteric teachings. The sect grew to approximately 20,000 members across 18 regions of Russia, and Rudnev, who had a history of psychiatric issues, was arrested in 1999, but escaped from a psychiatric hospital during a checkup and was later detained in 2005, but his followers refused to testify against him. Good on you, Rudnev. I don't know, he's probably a crazy fuck, so whatever. There's also Mikhail Zaika and the ritualistic murders he committed in 1999, and his accomplice, known as Kondrashev. They committed a series of ritualistic murders influenced by neo-paganism. Their first victim was 17-year-old Valery Vasilyev, whom they lured into an abandoned building, drugged, and then killed using ritualistic methods. The case highlighted the potential dangers of combining occult beliefs with criminal intent. That's always the way, isn't it? And then there's also Andrei Surikov, a former traffic officer who, along with two accomplices, began hijacking motorists so they could steal and then sell their cars. He did this in uniform, and after stabbing a man that would later escape, they were arrested, with Surikov being declared incompetent to stand trial. So after spending time in a psychiatric facility, Andrei Surikov developed an obsession with Satanism and occult literature. This was in the mental asylum that this happened. He began attacking teenagers and young women after escaping, and choking them with a rope before stabbing them with a stiletto. Surikov's 3 murders in 2008 were marked by ritualistic elements, including leaving personal items from previous victims at the crime scene of the next victim. So these cases illustrate the complex relationship between occult practices and criminal activities in post-Soviet Russia. While some instances were genuine criminal acts, others were influenced by social fears and the resurgence of esoteric beliefs. This period serves as a reminder of how social upheaval can lead to the revival of occult practices and the emergence of related criminal activities. Also, Russia currently hosts several right-wing, ultra-nationalist occult groups, many of which blend esoteric beliefs with radical political ideologies. Sounds familiar, huh? These groups often promote Russian ethnic supremacy, anti-Western sentiment, and a return to pre-Christian pagan traditions. I can't fault that one, I guess. So there's Rodnovery, which is the Slavic native faith. It's a revival of pre-Christian Slavic paganism, emphasizing ethnic purity and ancestral worship. Yikes. They celebrate traditional festivals. There's rituals and ceremonies rooted in ancient Slavic customs. And while some factions are peaceful, I think for the most part this group is peaceful. Others have been associated with nationalist and xenophobic rhetoric. It's kind of like a Satru, pagan, Norse paganism, but the Slavic variety. Next up, oh man, this guy. Got Alexander Dugin and Eurasianism. Now, Dugin has been described as the modern equivalent to Rasputin as far as his ideas having significant influence on current-day Russian political elites, including Vladimir Putin. He advocates for a quote-unquote multipolar world and the revival of a Russian empire, drawing from esoteric and occult traditions. Basically, it plays out that throughout history, there have been 2 kinds of empires, the Atlantean or the Eurasian. And basically, Eurasia is the only Eurasian power which has a strong influence on land and the conquering of land and fortification of empires within that land, whereas the Atlantean model relies more on strong navies and economic power. So, the British Empire, America, etc., things like that. Then you've got Pamyat, a nationalist movement that combines Russian Orthodox Christianity with elements of occultism and esoteric traditions, promotion of Russian cultural heritage, and opposition to perceived foreign influences. Kick out them foreigners. Kick out them foreigners. They're in every fucking country, those people. There's occultism in Russian far-right movements in general, just integration of occult and esoteric beliefs into far-right ideologies, emphasizing spiritual warfare against perceived enemies, as long as it's spiritual, I guess. Use of symbols like the black sun and occult rituals to promote nationalist and anti-liberal agendas. Gotta watch out for those liberal agendas. They'll get you every time. But these groups often operate in the shadows, blending spiritual beliefs with political agendas. And their influence varies, but they contribute to the complex tapestry of far-right batshit extremism existing in Russia right now. Now, lest you think that everything that's come out of Russia is utter shite, I do want to comment on one particular movement that came out of the late 19th, early 20th century, and that is Russian Cosmism. Russian Cosmism was a philosophical and spiritual movement that emerged in pre-Soviet Russia, primarily associated with thinkers like Nikolai Fyodorov, nailed it, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and later Alexander Chizhevsky. Its central tenets combined scientific optimism, metaphysical speculation, and ethical imperatives, envisioning a future in which humanity could overcome death, disease, and material limitations through technological and spiritual advancement. Some of the key principles include immortality and resurrection. Fyodorov advocated for the active resurrection of all dead humans through scientific means, linking this goal to a moral duty to humanity. There's cosmic evolution. The cosmists envisioned humanity not only improving life on Earth, but also colonizing the cosmos, extending life and promoting moral and intellectual development on a universal scale. Then there's the synthesis of science and spirit. Cosmism sought to bridge religion, ethics, and science, combining technological progress such as rocketry, biology, and mechanics with ethical and spiritual guidance. And there's utopian optimism, which, unlike many contemporaneous movements, which were deeply fatalistic or politically manipulative at best, Cosmism offered a positive vision of human destiny, emphasizing collective responsibility, unity, and the potential for harmonious interaction with the cosmos. So, while Cosmism never became a mainstream ideology, its ideas profoundly influenced Soviet space research, cryonics, and transhumanist thought. However, I'd say it differs greatly with transhumanism in that it contains a strong moral and ethical compass. You hear that, transhumanism? And continues to inspire philosophical and scientific discussions today. Unlike many pre-Soviet or esoteric movements that flirted with nationalism, mysticism, or destructive occult experiments, Cosmism was future-focused, constructive, and morally aspirational, making it a rare example of hope and ethical idealism to basically originate from that turbulent era, let's say. Now, let's get into what I kept calling the meat and potatoes of this episode. This is Boki and Barchenko, the Soviet equivalent of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. We've got two figures. First up is Gleb, G-L-E-B, Ivanovich Boki, B-O-K-I-I. Gleb Boki, one of the sillier names to come out of all this research. He was born on the 21st of June, 1879 in Tbilisi. He had a long career in Bolshevik revolutionary circles. He was a senior OGPU/NKVD official, head of the Special Department, later of the Ninth Department. He's officially documented as head of special sections, which includes cryptography, code breaking, and encoding, I guess. He was a master of both. He was responsible for all secret communications during his time in the revolutionary circles up to the Bolshevik Revolution and afterwards. So, special operations in the Soviet secret police from 1921 to 1934. Known also in secondary literature as an intelligence patron for projects with an esoteric or psychical angle. Ultimately, he was arrested and shot to death in May 1937 during the Great Terror, Stalin's purges. Multiple sources give the 15th of November 1937 as his execution date. However, many years later, in 1956, his image was quote-unquote rehabilitated. So they kind of like went back and they were like, boy, we really fucked that guy over, and he did a lot of great stuff for the country in our eyes. So let's clean things up a little, and we'll unphotoshop some things. But anyways, as the head of the OGPU's special section, Boki was among the most powerful Chekists of the time. The Chekists being the first Soviet secret police. He was often derisively called Dracula by his colleagues behind his back. Secretly, however, he maintained an interest in occultism, tantra, esoteric science, nude gardening, and occasional group sex with friends, and his prized private collection of mummified human penises. He collaborated with Alexander... Yep, that's right, I said it. He collaborated with Alexander Borchenko on expeditions to uncover quote-unquote hidden knowledge in Tibet and the Russian North. Boki believed such knowledge might be weaponized for state power, psychic energy, mind control, thought contagion, which is something he was particularly interested in, mass hysteria, in other words, and hidden technologies. But once again, he was arrested during Stalin's purges and executed in 1937, mostly because he did not do himself any favors just throughout his time as head of the special section. He had a bit of a sense of humor. He liked to play jokes on people. Like there was one incident, I believe, was recalled in Red Shambhala, where his special section got a wire communication from some state official saying, bring more vodka, and he told that state official's, henchmen basically, hey, here's where you can go get the free vodka, and they unknowingly broke into some sort of private reserve stash and nearly died in a shootout, all because old Gleb Boki liked to play just fucking pranks on people and stuff. So, but actually a lot of people said he was one of the few, actually humanized people within the secret police for those who met him outside the secret police. But all of his colleagues and people in other departments, they either hated him because, for various reasons, namely because he had some aristocracy in his family background, and also because they were jealous of how much power his department held over all the other secret police and the state officials. So in the early 1920s, the Cheka, once again the first Soviet secret police agency from 1917 to 1922, officials like Boki began entertaining the idea that certain psi phenomena might have intelligence or military applications. Barchenko, the guy we'll talk about in a second, and his expedition to Karelia was greenlit as a scientific mission, but internal documents suggest it was also intended to locate ancient sites of power or transmit psychic messages across a great distance. Internal memos referenced psychotronic harmonization and energetic influence on the masses, precursors to later Soviet research into mind control, mass hypnosis, and radio wave-based behavioral modulation. Sorry, I'm trying to combine two words. Modulation, modification, either way. By 1931, the occult section of the Cheka had been quietly folded into the broader, quote-unquote, Special Tasks Unit under what would later become the NKVD. Nearly all known participants were arrested and executed during the Great Purge from 36 to 38, and their papers confiscated. Boki, as the OGPU's special section chief, and Barchenko, an occultist scientist, were at the center of some of the strangest expeditions of the early Soviet era. Their trips combined intelligence work, archaeology, mysticism, and parapsychology. Now, Barchenko was born in 1881 in Yelets. He studied to be a doctor for some time, biological studies at Kazan University and Yuriev in Tartu. But after a while, he was like, this isn't interesting to me. He was more into the esoteric side of things. He's a biologist and researcher with documented interest in anomalous phenomena, ethnography of northern Siberia, and mystical geography. Namely, he was very interested in anything having to do with Hyperborea or Shambhala or Agartha. And for our purposes in this episode, Shambhala and Agartha are basically interchangeable concepts, but these are themes that appear in much of his writing and correspondence. He worked in Moscow and had contacts with intellectual intelligentsia, circles interested in psychical research, etc. He later developed an OGPU link, multiple secondary sources, notably Znamenski, author of Red Shambhala, document Barchenko's collaboration with the OGPU officer Gleb Boki in the 1920s on state-sponsored investigations into long-distance thought transmission and other anomalous phenomena. Contemporary archival traces place Barchenko as a consultant in scientific directorates in the early 1920s. Eventually, he too was executed in Moscow in April 1938 during the Great Terror, date commonly given as April 25th, 1938. Alexander V. Barchenko was the so-called Red Merlin, writer, researcher who blended ethnography, hypnosis, ancient science, and Shambhala/Hyperborea myths. He worked with Boki, and much like Boki, was shot in 1938. There are modern scholarly treatments, largely, once again, Red Shambhala by Znamenski, that analyze him as a key bridge figure into much of what we'll be discussing next episode. Psychotronics. So he was a biologist, a mystic, and an occult researcher. Barchenko became infamous for blending esoteric speculation with Soviet scientific projects. He pursued quote-unquote ancient knowledge that he claimed was hidden in Hyperborea, aka the Russian far north, as well as various Tibetan mysteries. His collaborations with Boki brought him under the OGPU's patronage, but it also doomed him once Stalin grew suspicious of any quote-unquote mystical projects. Again, he was executed in 1938, but he remains a key link between esoteric traditions and early Soviet intelligence operations. Much of his research and writings remain confidential to this day and may have actually provided the required scientific foundations to later investigate thought transference or thought transmission during the era of Soviet psychotronics. One particularly sad aspect of this man's death, while he was imprisoned in the labor camps, he just refused to stop trying to make himself useful to the powers that be. He kept sending letters saying, I've discovered new scientific discoveries of this and that. Namely, his number one that is kind of held above all others is that he alleges to have discovered some kind of energy expulsion that occurs every time a cell in the human body multiplies. So there's some kind of inherent biological energy, whether you want to call it chi or orgone or whatever, but he claims to have discovered something along these lines, and then, bam, bullet in the back of the fucking head. But, like I said, many of his writings are still considered confidential. So there are people who have said that the things that Boki and Barchenko got up to, it's just like Bert Nerdy. I don't know. It's just silly to me. But the things they got up to are essentially the missing link, the essential kernel of what would later become much of the Soviet psychotronic era. Now, they were once again at the center of some strange expeditions, and I've got a quick list here we'll close out with. There's first the Kola Peninsula / Murmansk expedition from 1921 to 1922. Barchenko, with support from Boki, organized research trips to the Kola Peninsula in the Russian north. The expedition was framed as a study of the Sami people, their shamanic traditions, as well as a strange case of mass hysteria that specifically was afflicting this group of people, a culture-bound hysteria, if you will. And this hysteria was referred to as the Call of the North Star. And allegedly, those afflicted were suddenly susceptible to following commands without question, even if it meant attempting the nearly physically impossible or committing intense forms of self-harm. This is likely what largely sparked Boki's interest behind this particular expedition. But Barchenko also sought evidence of ancient Hyperborean civilizations, which he believed had preserved occult knowledge. Reports suggest the team studied megalithic sites, petroglyphs, and shamanic practices, attempting to link them to a universal science, quote unquote, of psychic energy. One source even claims they discovered an entire vast field or forested area that was teeming with antlers and animal skulls of immense mystical/religious significance. Allegedly, Barchenko also had at one point had his life saved by a female shaman who performed some sort of ritual healing upon him right in the midst of his having a heart attack. Boki's special section reportedly provided cover and logistical aid, ensuring the OGPU, which, once again, that's the NKVD precursor, they had oversight of all the findings from this expedition. This is perhaps the most well-documented of their joint operations, and later Soviet-era whispers suggested they may have uncovered ruins or ritual sites considered too politically volatile to publicize. Then there's the speculative Altai expedition in the mid-1920s. Some accounts hint that Barchenko and Boki collaborated on an exploratory mission into the Altai Mountains, a region long associated with esoteric lore and later mythologized by the Roriks. The official cover would have been ethnographic and geographical surveys, but Barchenko's focus remained on tracing remnants of quote-unquote ancient brotherhoods and studying local shamanic techniques thought to open altered states of consciousness. The Altai, like the Himalayas, was often rumored to be a quote-unquote gateway to Shambhala, or hidden centers of wisdom. Instances of what would today be labeled or interpreted as UFO sightings have quite a substantial history of occurrence there as well. Evidence for this expedition is weaker than the Kola trip, but surviving testimonies from Boki's circle suggest strong interest in the Altai as part of their search for psychic technologies that could be militarized. Then there was a proposed 1920s Tibetan/Himalayan expedition, though now we're getting into the more speculative. We don't know if these happened for sure. But both Boki and Barchenko were fascinated by Tibet and the persistent rumors of hidden lamassaries safeguarding advanced knowledge. Unlike the Roriks, they never made it there directly. The Roriks, they didn't find Shambhala, but they went into the Tibetan Himalayan mountains. So unlike the Roriks, they never made it there directly. But archival notes suggest they prepared at least one aborted attempt at a Soviet-backed Himalayan expedition. Plans circulated to send Barchenko east as a scientific emissary under Boki's protection, gathering intelligence while pursuing esoteric contacts. The plan tied into early Comintern, or Communist International efforts to court Buddhist populations in Mongolia and Tibet, once again falling under the banner of Red Shambhala. Russia was almost a Buddhist theocracy. Can you believe that? Fucking crazy. Anyways, though the expedition never materialized, the proposals revealed the fusion of intelligence work, esoteric ambition, and geographical strategy that defined their partnership. Then you've got an alleged Crimea and Black Sea research. Actually, I think this one's closer to having suspected to have actually happened. Barchenko also carried out studies in Crimea with Boki's approval. These expeditions involved archaeological digs and geomagnetic surveys, searching for evidence of lost civilizations in the Black Sea region. Local folklore about submerged cities and ancient temples fed into Barchenko's conviction that Eurasia had once hosted a highly advanced occult culture. Boki's special section used these operations partly as a cover for testing experimental equipment and monitoring emigre networks in the Crimea, which was a hotbed of anti-Soviet activity. Thus, the work had both a mystical and a counterintelligence edge. Then there were the various Moscow laboratory experiments. These are more... There was a Moscow laboratory provided to Barchenko. What all went on there? Not a lot of authentication, let's say. So, while not an expedition in the geographic sense, Boki and Barchenko's most significant collaboration may have been the secret laboratory established in Moscow. They use the word laboratory, but this is largely operated out of Barchenko's apartment. So here, under the special sections protection, They experimented with hypnosis, telepathy, suggestion, and occult ritual. Barchenko believed he was reviving fragments of ancient science, quote unquote, while Boki saw the potential for psychological control and intelligence applications. The lab drew in an eclectic group of scientists, mystics, and Chekist agents, becoming a hub for Soviet parapsychological inquiry. The collapse of these experiments after Boki's arrest in 1937 effectively ended his line of work, though it echoed in later KGB parapsychology projects. There were also rumors of requisition of shamanic drums from ethnographic collections said to be created out of human skin pulled over a pair of skulls because researchers believed they might have hypnotic or ritual potency for experiments, though this is somewhat contested. And then there's the conceptual expedition, the Shambhala Hyperborea project that was ongoing all throughout their partnership. Beyond their tangible journeys, Boki and Barchenko articulated a broader, ongoing, quote-unquote, expedition of the mind. It's an expedition of the mind, baby. The attempt to trace the origins of wisdom traditions back to Hyperborea in the north and Shambhala in the east. They imagined a unifying system of esoteric science, one that could be weaponized for Soviet purposes. Their expeditions, both real and planned, were thus steps in a much grander project of occult geopolitics. In this sense, their collaboration was as much about mapping hidden knowledge onto Soviet strategic horizons as it was about the fieldwork in specific places. The whole reason they both were so interested in all this stuff is because, once again, they saw the violence being produced as a result of the revolution, and they wanted to find some way to bring a spiritual evolution to mankind, specifically Soviet kind, and advance them in as a evolved civilization of the future. Less well attested and contested elements. There's claims that there were experiments involving tantric sex rites, orgies, ritualized group sex. There was group sex apparently in Boki's private life, but not so much ritualized. Or sexual energy training originating largely in this is brought up in Red Shambhala as well, which cites various archival fragments and memoirs and popular retellings. Like after time had passed, Boki in particular developed quite a reputation, if you will. He's considered some evil dark sorcerer like type dude, but he just seems, I don't know, just a weirdo, really. So yeah, but yeah, they were both killed in the purges, and Alexander Barchenko and Gleb Boki are documented historical figures who intersected. Barchenko is a biologist and anomalistics researcher. Boki as an OGPU/NKVD official with a history of running quote-unquote special departments. Scholarly work, most notably, once again, Red Shambhala. Get it, read it. It's fascinating. I couldn't put it down. I finished it all in one sitting. It reconstructs how their collaboration produced a short-lived, semi-official set of investigations into telepathy, psychical research, and inner Earth mythology. Hollow Earth shit involving Shambhala, Hyperborea, Agartha, etc. These reconstructions rest on a mixture of archival fragments and interpretive synthesis. Key factual anchors, such as their collaboration, their official roles, their arrests, and executions, are all solidly documented. This shit happened. Where things get speculative is the ritual sex orgies, tantric training programs, mummy raids for drums, giant Hyperborean cities reached by Soviet expeditions, etc. These are claims primarily recoverable through readings of fragmentary archival items and later popularized in conspiracy theory and myth-making. I included them, I mentioned them because to not do so would be a shame. So yeah, that's gonna pretty much encapsulate it all for today's episode. But I close out on Boki and Barchenko because next episode we're getting to where this starts, or actually where this ends with Boki and Barchenko. Starts and ends with Boki and Barchenko, and then we get into the decades Soviet psychotronic research. So it's going to be mind-bending. So thank you for putting up with my my sickness and whatever today. Just if I seem a little phoning it in, I apologize, but I felt it was necessary to lay this groundwork before we get into the psychotronic craziness. Once again, read Red Shambhala, because I barely covered I covered the superficial oversight of it. There's all kinds of other expeditions and missions involving the native Asiatic populations and different crazy characters playing off of like the Shambhala prophecies and the government manipulating religious prophecy, which is a big thing I'm interested in. so there's precedent for it. It's been around. See also CIA operations involving vampires in the Philippines, etc. Things of this nature. It happens. It's out there. It's real. But yeah, I'm gonna go sleep for a long time and hopefully get better after that. I'm gonna have a nice NyQuil nap, and I will see you folks next week for Psychotronic Freak Out, hopefully. So yeah, should everything go according to plan. Once again, I'm Mike Luck. This is Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, and I thank you very much. I love you guys. You make this all worthwhile. I hope you were entertained, and I hope you learned something, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Peace.
I am Igor Pachenko, the great Russian train robber. Be calm, or I will murder you.